Once there was a man who, deep in his soul, felt the need to be a Jew. His circumstances were adequate. He was fortunate to have a job as a reporter in which he could create according to the impulses of his heart and make a good living. He had long ceased to trouble his head about his Jewish origin or the faith of his fathers when the age old hatred reasserted itself under a fashionable slogan during the Dreyfus affair, which we'll get to soon. Like many others, our man too believed that this movement would soon subside, but instead of getting better, it got worse. Although he wasn't personally affected by the anti Semitism, the attacks pained him anew each time. Gradually, his soul became one bleeding wound. Fast forward to 1948, when the State of Israel is established, and it had this man's portrait hanging above the declaration ceremony. Now, the State of Israel likes to use the symbol of a menorah a lot. It's on its official state seal. The Knesset Parliament building has a stone menorah. It's on the money, on stamps, medals, and of course the golden menorah exhibit in Jerusalem. The official reason for the State of Israel's association with the menorah comes from ancient times, captured in ancient coins, historic engravings, and paintings, and it goes all the way back to the Torah. But this is a story about one man and his obsession with the menorah and how it reinvigorated Jewish identity in the Western world. That man is Theodor Herzl, the godfather of political Zionism, who found meaning in the Jewish candelabrum when once, deep in his soul, he felt the need to be a Jew. An army captain stands in the middle of a courtyard in front of the military academy, where his sword is being broken in front of him and all of his army honors and badges are being torn off onto the floor before him. This was his official degradation. Gathered there to watch the ceremonial humiliation are many of the ranking members of the academy and France's army. The man is Alfred Dreyfus, a French Jew who had been accused of the worst crime someone like him could commit, which is selling secrets to France's enemy. Inside the courtyard are also a group of journalists, and outside is a large crowd of Parisians who have come to watch the traitor get what he deserves. In the crowd of journalists is a young man who, like Alfred Dreyfus, wasn't very Jewish at all, an assimilated Westerner who happened to be a Jew named Theodor Herzl. Yet what disturbed Herzl was the reaction of the crowd. Their angry shouts weren't for justice to the traitor, but death to the Jew. Although Herzl also initially believed that Dreyfus was guilty, the reaction on part of the citizens in a modern city which he loved deeply disturbed him. Like many others, he believed that the age old reaction to Dreyfus would soon subside, and when it didn't, the feelings overwhelmed him so much that he would later write that gradually his soul became a bleeding wound. And this forced Herzl to examine his Jewishness in a way he wouldn't have to during better times. This experience made him realize that despite the fact that he grew up assimilated and was far away from the roots of his heritage, the only way out of this Jewish suffering, anti Semitism, was to embrace his Jewish identity. But when Herzl brought up these ideas to other assimilated Jews who were similarly frightened by the trends, they would challenge him. How could the answer to anti Semitism be embracing Jewish identity? How could a deepening of the problem be the remedy? Herzl, on the other hand, felt that the reason why the Jews in the high society of France were so anxious about anti Semitism is because they lost the spiritual counterpoise which their strong forefathers had possessed. Most people around him didn't agree with this idea and made fun of it, calling it his idée fixe or obsession. But Herzl handled it with equanimity and composure. Herzl chose to describe his belief that the way to deal with anti Semitism was to embrace Jewish identity as his idée maîtresse, his guiding principle. The truth is, Herzl was a man of modern sensibilities. He was deeply rooted in many non Jewish customs, from the cultures of Austro-Hungary and France, into which he was born and raised. So he needed to find a way to keep his vision of embracing Jewishness congruent with who he was and to transmit that to the next generation. The air in the large room in the Stadt Casino is stuffy from the overcrowding of guests who came to hear a speech at the First Zionist Congress. The man standing at the podium is Theodor Herzl, who is making a profound impression on the people there as he redefines national identity for the Jewish people in the modern era. A year earlier, in his work Der Judenstaat, or The Jewish State, Herzl argued his case, famously, for the formation of a Jewish homeland as a response to anti-Semitism in Europe. At the end of his life, Herzl published another book called Alt Neuland, a utopian novel envisioning what a Jewish homeland could become, and it reflected on this idea of creating a new, revitalized version of the ancient homeland. A few months later, when the holiday of Hanukkah rolled around, which for centuries had illuminated the marvel of the Maccabees with the glow of candles, he was ready to let it go by unobserved like most years. But his new guiding principle led him to buy a new menorah, so at the very least he could give his children a nice holiday memory. As he prepared the menorah, a strange mood came over him, a feeling of something intimate and homelike. He realized that just as the 8 candles of the menorah were lit with the fire from a 9th candle called the shamash, the message of the holiday of Hanukkah was to light the fire in others. After the first candle was lit, and the origin of the holiday, the miracle of the little lamp, which had burned so much longer than expected, and of course the War of the Maccabees were retold, he told his children all that he knew. Now, it probably wasn't much, but for them, it was enough. When the second candle was lit, the children repeated what he had told them, and although they learned it all from him, it seemed to him quite new and beautiful. And in the days that followed, he could hardly wait for the evening, which seemed to become ever brighter. Candle after candle was lit in the menorah, and together with his children, the father mused upon the lights. As the days went by, Herzl could not stop thinking about the menorah, and he began to wonder what inspired it. Now, he obviously knew that it was used in the temple and inscribed in the Torah, but he later learned that the form of the candelabrum was inspired by nature. And this was especially true of the style of the menorah, which has a stem in the center and branches to the right and to the left, each pair below the other on the same level and all reaching the same height. And this was inspired by a plant that is indigenous to the area of today's Israel called Salvia palestina, which is a type of sage plant. This form was used by Jewish people for ages to mark good times in synagogues, sculptures, and on everyday items, and to mark darker times in Jewish cemeteries, tombs, and Holocaust memorials like Baba Yar. But why has this simple artistic form taken from nature captured the imagination of the generations? And Herzl wondered whether it was possible to infuse new life into the form of the menorah, to water its roots, so to speak, like those of the ancient tree which inspired it. And so, on the last day of 1897, Herzl published an essay called The Menorah in an Austrian paper called Die Welt. And it described the story from the Dreyfus affair and how the menorah inspired him to embrace his Jewishness and kindle the light in others. Throughout the rest of his life, Herzl engaged in diplomatic efforts. He negotiated with world leaders to get support for the establishment of a Jewish homeland. Herzl's enduring legacy lies in the establishment of the Jewish state in 1948, and his role in shaping modern Israeli identity. Herzl settled in a villa in the Austrian countryside of the Alps and will pass away in 1904 at the age of 44. On his last Hanukkah, he reflected on what the menorah meant to him in his search for a reinvigorated, yet modern, Jewish identity. When he had resolved to return to the ancient fold and openly acknowledge his return, he had only intended to do what he considered honorable and sensible. But he had never dreamed that on his way back home, he would also find gratification for his longing for beauty. Yet what befell him was nothing less. The menorah, with its glowing brilliance, was indeed a thing of beauty, and inspired lofty thoughts. Inspired by the motif of the 8 arms of equal height, which projected from a central stem, he was inspired to recapture the vibrant beauty of the menorah by drawing a design that was directly from nature. He drew a tree with slender branches, whose ends opened up like the bud which holds a flower called a calyx, which would hold a light. Although in real life, Herzl had a strained relationship with his family, since he spent much of his time away from them on his diplomatic shuttles around the world to lay the groundwork for the Jewish state. After Herzl's untimely death, his children would follow suit, where 2 of his children died at their own hands, and a third one dying in a Nazi concentration camp in Theresienstadt. Yet, in his essay about the menorah, Herzl writes about spending Hanukkah with his children in a spiritual, almost mythical way. There came the 8th night, on which the entire row of lights is kindled, although the faithful 9th candle, the shamash, which otherwise only serves to light the others. A great radiance shone forth from the menorah. The eyes of the children sparkled. When all the candles are ablaze, everyone must stop in amazement and rejoice, and no office is more blessed than that of a servant of the light. On May 14th, 1948, now in another crowded room, this time in Tel Aviv, representatives from various Jewish communities in British Mandate Palestine met to hear the reading of the Declaration of Independence for the new state of Israel. And as the declaration was being read by David Ben-Gurion, who would become the next prime minister of Israel, he stood beneath a large portrait of Theodor Herzl. And today, Herzl is commemorated with a mountain named after him in Israel, where his remains are entombed, as well as institutions and places named after him like Herzliya. But his vision and obsession with the menorah has also become part of the Israeli experience. In fact, the Jewish Legion of the British Army, who fought in the area of Israel during World War I, would wear a badge on their caps with a menorah. It's safe to say that the menorah is one of the most universal Jewish symbols, even in thoroughly secular circles, in part thanks to the idea of connecting our Jewish identity to the symbolism of the menorah. For Herzl, the holiday of Hanukkah became a parable, a lesson for the awakening of the whole nation. First, one candle. It is still dark, and the solitary light looks gloomy. Then it finds a companion. Then another. And yet another. The darkness must retreat. If you're still watching, first off, thank you for being here to the end of this video. This video was an adaptation of the original essay written by Herzl in 1897 called The Menorah, although I changed around some of his words and added context where I felt it was necessary. So I hope you enjoyed the little journey. I actually wrote this essay for last Hanukkah, and so I'm glad I got around to it in time for this one. And in fact, I did a massive deep dive on the Dreyfus affair over the past year, which is a really interesting and frankly important part of Jewish history. So I'm excited to potentially explore that here on this channel as well. So let me know if you'd be interested in that and what stood out to you in Herzl's embrace of Jewishness. If you're new to this channel, my name is David, and here we discuss what it means to be Jewish by looking at history, culture, and art. For example, you can check out the Film Club episodes here.